In the ancient history of the Middle East, a man named Abraham received a promise from God that he would become the father of many nations. The Bnei Yisrael are the Jewish descendants of Abraham's son Isaac from his wife Sarah. The Bnei Ishmael are the Arabic descendants of Abraham's son Ishmael from his wife's handmaiden Hagar. From the house of Israel, the Jewish prophet Moses would be born, and the Torah would be written. Centuries later, from the house of Israel, Jesus, the Messiah of the Christian faith, would be born, and the New Testament would be written. From the house of Ishmael, the Islamic prophet Muhammad would be born, and the Quran would be written. Through the centuries, the three religions of the Abrahamic faith have collided. In no place more so than Jerusalem. With the fall of the Ottoman Empire after World War I, ancient nations were restored in the Middle East, including the state of Israel, fulfilling Old Testament prophecies. And every U.S. president since has tried, with greater or lesser success, to build the alliances needed for a lasting peace. Recently, at an unlikely time, with an unlikely group, led by an unlikely president, nations of the divided faiths of Abraham came together against all odds and laid a foundation for peace that bears the name of their common father, the Abraham Accords. To many people, Jerusalem is the place where modern history began, where their faith began. It's a place of huge inspiration, and it's been a place of conflict. That dome of the rock is really the story of Abraham. It's where God tested Abraham, and Abraham passed the test, and God promised that he'd become the father of many nations. The many nations were divided through his two children, Isaac and Ishmael. They were great rivals, to the point where Ishmael was banished from Abraham's house. But they reconciled. When Abraham died, they buried their father together in the tomb of the patriarchs. And the lesson from that is that Jews and Muslims, Christians and Muslims, are not eternal rivals or eternal enemies. The Bible tells us that they can reconcile. And so the Abraham Accords is the story of ancient peoples revitalizing their reconciliation after 4,000 years. This happened in a way that was very different than all the other previous peace efforts in the Middle East, except perhaps for one common factor. It began without people believing that there was ever much hope.
President Trump is expected to unveil his long-awaited Middle East peace plan. However, skepticism remains extremely high. This comes as President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu both face political turmoil.
So, you worked in the White House.
West Wing.
You were in the West Wing. In the first couple of years, the number of leaks coming out of the White House.
Working in the Trump administration, we had our backs up against the wall. For whatever reason, nobody thought that we would be able to accomplish much of anything. We knew that people would say, what do these guys know? They don't come from this world. Look, you've got Jared Kushner, David Friedman, Avi Berkowitz. You know, it's
Three Orthodox
Jews.
To me, that doesn't sound like a good start.
I came into this having observed really the ups and downs of working in an administration because it's very difficult. It's highly contentious. People are always expecting you to fail. People were starting to give up. You know, when you talk about Middle East peace, people refer to it as the example of impossible things.
A critical breakthrough first came in 1977.
We are privileged to witness tonight a significant achievement in the cause of peace, an achievement none thought possible a year ago.
The anger between Arabs and Israelis, which was kept in check yesterday, clothed in firm but mostly polite language, came right out into the open today.
Yasser Arafat extended his hand to Yitzhak Rabin, and after a moment, Rabin took it.
Since 1994, there has not been a peace deal between Israel and an Arab country.
Such were the relations between Israel and Jordan during the last 47 years, a desert.
Since 1994. I was 6 years old.
War made it dead. Peace will make it alive. I hope what has happened today will go on, will walk on, will march on until the whole Middle East will be a region of peace, of promise and prosperity.
There will be no Middle East peace agreement this time.
The biggest stumbling block was how to divide Jerusalem. And in the end, that is what doomed the talks.
Even when there were peace deals between Israel and other countries, the relationship was a cold peace. It wasn't thriving.
Will this be a seismic shift of US policy? What does Netanyahu hope to gain out of this meeting?
A rare visit to the White House by Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas.
I believe that the issue of the settlements is not the core of the conflict, nor does it really drive the conflict.
Our fundamental problem is with the occupation and settlements.
Over time, positions on paths forward have become hardened. There are segments of the international community that believe that Israel should compromise in ways that we fundamentally disagree with from a security standpoint, from a relationship standpoint, from an economic standpoint.
President Trump's notion was, we're elected, we're here, our job is to take on the hard challenges, and he really gave us the mandate to try. One of the experts, who's on television all the time, came in to see me early on, and I said, well, this is my approach, I'd like your advice. And I said, do you think that we'll have a chance of success? And he said, absolutely not. I said, why are you so definitive? And he said, well, Jared, it's just math. You know, nobody's made any money betting on success in the Middle East in the last 25 years. You know, in Washington, it's a funny game, right? And what I learned after the first year, which was a lot rougher for me. I mean, I was adjusting to a new vocation, a lot of subjects that I didn't have, deep expertise on. I was working with a lot of new people. Some liked me, some didn't like me, some were threatened by me. And what I learned very quickly is, like, the game is the game. I didn't invent the game. You have to get better, you have to get smarter, you have to try. Then you just have to adjust.
You're gonna get hit. You're gonna get hit pretty hard. On your name, on the way you look, on what you've done, on why you're sitting in the chair you're sitting in, you're gonna get hit. And the question is does that knock you out? Or does that steel you for future hits, and you just keep moving?
the incoming was in front of you, behind you, to the right of you.
I'm still not sure where it was coming from.
Every day there was another assault. The first draft was probably done within the first 6 months of the Trump administration.
And I give Jason Greenblatt a lot of credit for that. It was on his computer.
It was on his computer.
Which, by the way, I inherited when he left, so then it was on my computer.
Well, it was never on mine.
And by the way, our team had 2-star generals. It had officials in the National Security Council. This is a serious team.
I learned in Washington, it's very rare that there's a straight line between 2 points, and problem solving is about pushing something forward, and nobody truly knows what the reaction's going to be until you do something. So, one of the things that, I said to the team, yourself included in the beginning, was that this problem is like a big concrete wall. And the president basically has told us he wants us to try to break through the wall. And so, I don't know, maybe it's a concrete wall, everyone says it's a concrete wall. Maybe it's atrophied, maybe it's actually a paper mache wall. We don't know, but what we have to do is go and hit it, and we've got to hit it with everything we've got.
The stage was set back in May of 2017 when President Trump went to Saudi Arabia.
I would like to thank King Solomon for his extraordinary words and the magnificent kingdom of Saudi Arabia for hosting today's summit. In my inaugural address to the American people, I pledged to strengthen America's oldest friendships and to build new partnerships in pursuit of peace. I also promised that America will not seek to impose our way of life on others, but to outstretch our hands in the spirit of cooperation and trust. That is why I chose to make my first foreign visit a trip to the heart of the Muslim world, to the nation that serves as custodian of the 2 holiest sites in the Islamic faith.
So that moment was a real reset. If you go back in history to the 2016 campaign, radical Islamic extremism was a very controversial topic, but a very big topic. So at the time, you had ISIS beheading American journalists, killing Christians. They had a territorial caliphate the size of Ohio that they controlled, and they were planning terror acts from that area. Libya was basically a mess. Egypt almost became a mess. You had Syria was in a civil war, 500,000 people were killed. Yemen became destabilized as well.
We are here to offer partnership based on shared interests and values to pursue a better future for all of us. Few nations have been spared the violent reach of terrorism. But in sheer numbers, the deadliest toll has been exacted on the innocent people of Arab, Muslim, and Middle Eastern nations. Some estimates hold that more than 95% of the victims of terrorism are themselves Muslim. We now face a humanitarian and security disaster in this region that is spreading across the planet. No description of the suffering and depravity can begin to capture its full measure. The true toll of ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, Hamas, and so many others must be counted not only in the number of dead, it also must be counted in generations of vanished dreams.
On that trip, President Trump in the speech laid out 4 objectives, and he did it in Saudi Arabia, which is the custodian of the 2 holiest sites in Islam, the leader of the Islamic world, and he assembled leaders from the 54 Arab and Muslim countries to come hear the speech. And he said, this isn't America's problem, this is all of our problem. We have to work on these 4 priorities together. Number 1 is Iran.
From Lebanon to Iraq to Yemen, Iran funds arms and trains terrorists, militias, and other extremist groups that spread destruction and chaos across the region. For decades, Iran has fueled the fires of sectarian conflict and terror. It is a government that speaks openly of mass murder, vowing the destruction of Israel, death to America, and ruin for many leaders and nations in this very room.
Number 2 is ISIS, right? We have this prevalent cancer that's been expanding. We need to all come together and eliminate it and then figure out how it doesn't come back again. Number 3 was Islamic extremism, where it basically was saying, we have to change the way we deal with these extremists. We can't be tolerating the terror financing. We can't be tolerating the spread of the ideology.
But above all, we must be united in pursuing the one goal that transcends every other consideration. That goal is to meet history's great test, to conquer extremism.
The final pillar, the 4th pillar, was really talking about the Israeli-Arab conflict and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We need to create new boundaries based on opportunities in the future, not be stuck in conflicts of the past, and we need to build new bridges. He saw this as a great threat to Israel, to the entire world, to the stability of the global economy.
The potential of this region has never, ever been greater. 65% of its population is under the age of 30. Like all young men and women, they seek great futures to build, great national projects to join, and a place for their families to call home. This region should not be a place from which refugees flee, but to which newcomers flock. The birthplace of civilization is waiting to begin a new renaissance. We pray this special gathering may someday be remembered as the beginning of peace in the Middle East.
After that, the president took a direct flight from Riyadh.
It was explained, President Trump, you have to stop in Jordan because Saudi and Israel don't have relations. President Trump says, I have to make a technical stop because those guys don't talk to each other? Didn't I just meet with the king? And it became the first official direct flight from Saudi to Israel.
Distinguished guests, Air Force One has just landed in Israel.
This was a historic flight.
You just flew from Riyadh to Tel Aviv. I hope that one day an Israeli prime minister will be able to fly from Tel Aviv to Riyadh.
And then after that, we went to visit the Pope at the Vatican in Rome. And it really was a symbol of how the president's goal was to bring together the Abrahamic faiths and to stop a lot of the divisions and the divides that had occurred that caused so much needless destruction.
If you look at what President Trump's first speech was, here are his first foreign policy speeches to the Arab Summit. And what he says is, we want all of us to unite against terrorism. That's when the Arab countries perked up, because they'd all felt what those tentacles of terrorism was.
Just over the last decade, the understanding of leaders in the Arab world of what their interests are began to change. And I think it's a result of several factors that actually predate President Trump. One of them was the Arab Spring, where the stability of these regimes were called into question. Another one that was very important was the rise of Iran, working to undermine the stability of those countries. And one other factor, and this is all before President Trump comes into office. Israel is a global technological power. It is the second great center of innovation after Silicon Valley. And if you think about the traditional Arab boycott of Israel, which has been going on for decades, it made as much sense as Oregon, Nevada, Utah, Wyoming, Arizona, New Mexico, and half of Southern California boycotting Silicon Valley. So to the extent that you have leaders in the Arab world who are thinking about the security of their country, the prosperity of their country, a partnership with Israel is critical. And for them to make a political move in order to surface a relationship that was beginning underneath the surface is very hard. And here's the role of the administration comes in and really makes a dramatic change.
The administration's changes broke not only with international policy, but with many of the United States' own presidents. In December of 2016, just a couple of months before you took over, the UN, with the support of the United States, passed the UN Security Council Resolution 2334, which held in part that all this space over here, Mount of Olives, Temple Mount, the Western Wall, all of it was illegally occupied territory. That's the environment that you stepped into.
The day or 2 days before it was going to happen, I got word that this was happening, tried to call the former ambassador just to say, what's happening? This was a massive move to make before a change in administration. She didn't call me back. When I got to the United Nations, I was determined to find out, how did that happen? What were the details behind it? And what I found out, that it was the U.S. that led the charge.
Yeah.
And I meet with Danny Danon, the Israeli ambassador to the UN. He was trying to find out what was going on. No one from the U.S. administration was calling him back. They were trying to connect the president with the prime minister. Obama was in Hawaii and said he couldn't take the call.
Yeah.
And he had to find out from countries like Russia and China what was getting ready to happen. And then the resolution is read, and you know, at the Security Council, you've got all the countries around the table, and then you have the country that they're talking about. So there's Israel, Danny Danon, sitting at the table with everybody else. They read the resolution, all in favor. You know, people, they raise their hand, and the U.S. abstains.
The U.S. has taken the strongest action in years against long-standing ally Israel by abstaining from a UN vote condemning Israeli settlements.
David, it got worse. They all stood up and applauded when this passed. So you have all the Security Council members applauding, you have the audience applauding, and there's Danny Danon representing Israel sitting there.
Yeah.
How could we do that to a friend? And if the United States could do that to Israel, what message does that send to the rest of the world?
The president telling the heads of Israel, Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and the Palestinians today he will recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital. An unprecedented move, breaking with U.S. policy since Israel was created.
1995, Congress adopted the Jerusalem Embassy Act, urging the federal government to relocate the American embassy to Jerusalem. This act passed Congress by an overwhelming bipartisan majority. Every previous American president has exercised the law's waiver. Presidents issued these waivers under the belief that delaying the recognition of Jerusalem would advance the cause of peace. Nevertheless, the record is in. After more than 2 decades of waivers, we are no closer to a lasting peace agreement between Israel and the Palestinians. It would be folly to assume that repeating the exact same formula would now produce a different or better result.
The president made a very gutsy decision to move the embassy, even though it was obviously American law and something that previous presidents had promised. One Arab leader said to me, look, I'm not going to tell you to move the embassy, and I'm not going to tell you not to move the embassy. But what I will tell you is that if you decide to do it, you'll find out who your friends are. There's a lot of jockeying outside, people trying to scare the president out of doing it.
There has been condemnation of President Trump's move across the globe. Palestinian leader Mahmoud Abbas said the announcement could lead to wars that never end.
The State Department tonight warning embassies around the world to be alert for violence.
I get asked occasionally, what do I think was the most important thing that the Trump administration did along the way? I always refer to the embassy move. You were in the CIA then?
Yes. We provided our best analysis. It too was rooted in a legacy history predictive of bad things happening, of real risk, not only in the Middle East, right? We were concerned about what happened in a place like Pakistan, or a place that might happen in Jakarta. Lots of places that there was real risk that had been identified by the national security apparatus. And President Trump said, fine, prepare, do the right thing, get that piece right. We want to keep everyone safe and lay the groundwork for this. We don't want to create the conditions for violence.
How do you see the significance of the embassy move?
Yeah, it was the fulcrum, and it was the launch pad at the same time. So it was both a lever and a rocket, in the sense of it did demonstrate that President Trump was serious about living up to the campaign promises that he had made.
Making Jerusalem the capital of Israel was such a big thing for every president, and then they got in, they wouldn't do it. I understand why, by the way, and I've told it many times, why wouldn't they do it? And then you get in and you have every country calling, saying, please don't do that, please don't do that, you can't do that. And this happened to many other presidents, many other presidents. They'd campaign about the capital of Israel, and it was going to be Jerusalem. They were going to do it right away, and they never did it. There was tremendous pressure put on them, and I just turned off the telephones and I got it done.
After World War I and the fall of the Ottoman Empire, the newly formed League of Nations granted a mandate to Great Britain for the territory called Palestine, a vast expanse of land that today includes Jordan and Israel. The mandate for Palestine include fostering political, administrative, and economic conditions that would enable independent rule of the area's territory. After World War II, the League of Nations was replaced with the United Nations. At the request of Great Britain, one of the UN's very first tasks was to aid in the formation of an Arab and a Jewish state within Palestine. In 1947, the United Nations passed a resolution known as the Partition Plan, recommending the creation of an independent Arab state and an independent Jewish state. Israel accepted the Partition Plan. The Arab nations all rejected it. Upon the termination of the British mandate that ended at midnight on May 14, 1948, Israel declared independence and reaffirmed Jerusalem as its capital. Forces from Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon immediately attacked the new nation. Although Israel won its war for independence, Jordanian forces occupied the eastern part of Jerusalem, containing the historic Jewish Quarter, the Temple Mount, and the Western Wall. Jerusalem remained divided for 19 years, and during that time, Jews were not permitted to enter the eastern part of the city. Then, in 1967, during the Six-Day War, Israel captured East Jerusalem. Every prime minister since has declared the city the eternal and undivided capital of the Jewish state. The United States has said the same thing since passage of the Jerusalem Embassy Act in 1995. Although Israel asserted sovereignty over all of Jerusalem since 1967, Israel has permitted open access to all of the Abrahamic faiths to worship at their respective holy sites. Just before the Trump administration took office, the prior administration permitted the United Nations to pass a resolution declaring, among other things, that Israel was illegally occupying eastern Jerusalem, the area that Israel had captured in the 1967 war. That resolution was rejected by Israel and many American leaders of both political parties.
A strong message from the international community to the United States. Jerusalem cannot be recognized as Israel's capital.
3,000 years ago, King David declared the city of Jerusalem the capital of the Jewish people. Temple in Jerusalem was destroyed. The Jewish people were exiled from Jerusalem, but the connection between Jerusalem and the Jewish people was never broken. It will never be broken. Not by the Romans, not by the Babylonians, not by the Ottoman Turks, not by the British Empire, and not by the United Nations.
At an emergency session at the UN, 128 countries voted in favor of a resolution to effectively make US President Donald Trump's decision on Jerusalem null and void.
There was also an attack at him from the conventional thinking, which is if you're going to give this big concession to Israel, why aren't you getting something for it? And what people didn't realize and what President Trump understood is that he was getting something for it. He was building credibility in the region by showing that when he makes a promise, he's going to deliver his promise. And that gave him maneuverability and the credibility to do different things down the road.
The Arab states, and not just the Arab states in this region, but countries around the world understand that there is a unique relationship between Israel and the United States. When there is no daylight in that relationship, when the United States is embracing Israel, that sends a very powerful message to the states throughout the region.
My heart for Israel comes from my faith, but it also comes from my heart as an American. Love for Israel echoes out of every little buckboard church along every little highway and byway across the heartland. I think the fact that President Trump first trip overseas was to visit with the leaders of 50 Arab nations and then went to Israel. And then a short time after that made the decision to move the American embassy to Jerusalem. What not only Israel saw and the American people saw, but Arab nations in the region saw, is that America stands with Israel, but that America is also prepared to stand with Arab nations of goodwill.
The United States has long-standing allies among the Arab nations, with many goals and values in common. Even in these relationships, a recurring sticking point has often been disagreement surrounding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
I went to meet with the Palestinians and with their negotiators, and what I very quickly came to realize is I pulled all the documents. I wanted to see what they'd agreed on or not agreed on in the past. I was trying to scope out the deal. What I realized is nothing's changed in the deal in the last 25 years.
In 2002, there was an Arab Peace Initiative. In those years, there were people who were going on around the world saying the single greatest problem in the Middle East, if not the whole world, was the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And so people for a very long time were focused on that as being central to change in the Middle East.
The framework that we used the entire time was, if we come up with this conclusion, will this make Israel more safe? And will this make the Palestinian people have the opportunity to live a better life? And if the answer was yes to both, we thought that was the proper compromise.
The international community has taken a different approach to this issue in ways that never were able to put the Israeli leadership and the Israeli public at ease as it relates to their security.
We got Israel to put a very detailed, credible offer on the table, and the Palestinians wouldn't engage with it.
When people would say to me, if we could only solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Israel would have peace with 22 Arab states, or Israel have peace with 57 states with big Islamic populations, I'd say, well, that's great. Maybe that's true. But what if the Palestinians don't want to make peace? What do we do then?
Late on Monday night, the Palestinian leadership issued a statement that could have far-reaching consequences for the peace process. The statement includes the call to suspend recognition of Israel, suspend security coordination with it, and unite the Palestinian factions.
والآن قلنا لا لترامب ولغير ترامب لا لن نقبل مشروعه.
Boss Mahmoud Abbas there in Cairo to garner support in the Arab world for his, let's say, crusade against the Trump administration.
Well, he took his grievances and his anger toward President Trump to Cairo. However, there is a doubt about how much support these Arab countries, the moderate, so to speak, are giving to the Palestinian leadership. He complained about it on Sunday night.
So it began with a hypothesis, and the hypothesis was this, that decades of U.S. policy that had given the Palestinian Authority a veto over striking deals, over increasing the capacity for peace and prosperity in the Middle East, that heading down that path was a dead end. We had a lot of evidence to support that. And so we said, no, we're gonna take this hypothesis that says, no, we think there is a way to build peace and prosperity, even if that conflict cannot be resolved first.
Both of us were employed by the State Department. You ran the State Department. You had a very large organization, one of the largest in the world. I got a lot of pushback along the way from people who'd been there, for 20, 30 years, who just were completely uncomfortable with our policies regarding Israel. How did you deal with that?
Frankly, as a CIA director, I heard it from the analysts at the CIA. We heard it from our diplomats at the State Department, our colleagues who'd been working this problem set for decades. People told us, you can't do this. This won't work. It's impossible. Until the Palestinians release their veto on the peace process, you can't get any of this done. The foreign policy establishment in Washington and the foreign policy establishment in these Arab countries all believed that you couldn't get through the fire, so to speak.
There will be no advance and separate peace with the Arab world without the Palestinian process and Palestinian peace. No, 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 and no.
There are people that had been working this issue who knew everything there was to know about the West Bank. There were people that knew everything there was to know about the Gaza Strip and had been working these diplomatic issues for their entire careers, their entire lives. And so when we show up and say, we're gonna take a swing at this from another direction, yeah, you got lots of pushback. I have lots of memos, most of which everyone's read because someone leaked them from the State Department.
There was a foreign policy elite, an unelected foreign policy elite in Israel as well, and they all get together, they all reinforce each other's views. But you walk into the marketplace in Jerusalem or in Tel Aviv, and all those people, they are not with the foreign policy elite.
I was running for Congress. It would have been my first time. It would have been 2010, probably in the spring. And we took 6 questions from the audience. 3 of the questions were about Israel. And people in Attica, Kansas understood the current model, the current set of relationships that were unsustainable. They were unsustainable from an American security standpoint. They were unsustainable if you were looking for peace in the broader region.
We want the Palestinians to have a better life. But when you have Iran that funds a terrorist organization that has taken over the Palestinian area, this is not about the Palestinians. This is about Hamas. And all they have said the entire time is death to Israel. And guess what they say after that? Death to America.
What has happened over the last decade is a change in the Arab world and a strategic understanding that it is in their national interest to move into a relationship with Israel. It was not the case 20 years ago. Had President Trump been president in 2000, I don't know if he would have been able to achieve this breakthrough. In 2008, I don't know if he would have been able to achieve this breakthrough. You have to understand the environment had shifted.
Arab leaders are set to meet in Saudi Arabia for a summit on Sunday as world powers face off over Syria and rising tensions between Riyadh and Tehran.
The Syrian crisis dominated the agenda a mere 24 hours after the US, Britain and France launched airstrikes on the country in response to regime chemical attacks in Ghouta and Douma last week. Saudi Arabia's King Salman has accused Iran of blatant interference in regional affairs. Terrorism and the war in Yemen are also on the summit's agenda.
I was meeting with 2 Arab countries that were meeting with me and the British ambassador, talking about Yemen. And they were going on and said, why is everyone condemning us? Why don't they condemn the Houthis? Why don't they see them for the terrorist organization that they are? And they were just ranting on that. And I said, can I stop you for 1 second? I said, the same case you're making about Houthis in Yemen, I could make about Hamas in Israel. And they got really quiet. After the meeting, they took me out and they said, you're right. And I said, why do you do it? Why do you beat up Israel so much if you know I'm right? And they said, we do it to appease our constituencies. And I said, at some point, you're going to have to tell your constituencies the truth.
If you talked, as I did, to Arab leaders, admittedly in secret, you could hear a different tune. They also said the same to America's representatives. In the corridors, they wouldn't say it in an open forum or in press interviews. But even there, they started changing their tune publicly. So the data was available, but beyond the data is the understanding that what has been pursued for a quarter of a century, it's 25 years, 26 years. In that quarter of a century, people were really locked into this old view that of Palestinian centrality, that the Middle East conflict, always in the singular, conflict. There weren't myriad conflicts in the Middle East between the Arab states themselves, between the radical Islamists and the moderate Islamists, between the haters of the West and those who want to become part of the West. None of that existed. The only thing that existed was this conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. Well, I can tell you, Israel could cease to exist, something that won't happen, I guarantee you. And the same conflicts would go on and on and on.
The Arab League summit in Tunisia took place against a backdrop of division, war, and unrest across the region.
After 8 years of war in Syria, Arab League leaders remain divided over readmitting President Bashar al-Assad.
It's also 8 years since the revolution toppled Muammar Gaddafi, yet Libya remains one of the most unstable countries in the world.
It's 4 years since the Saudi-led coalition launched its war against the Houthis in Yemen, killing thousands of civilians and creating the world's worst humanitarian crisis. Neighboring Algeria is seeing an unprecedented protest movement demanding the resignation of the 82-year-old ailing president, Abdelaziz Bouteflika.
It's unacceptable that our region continues to top the list of countries grappling with refugees, crises, terrorism, and economic stagnation.
There has been disagreement behind the scenes about how to react to the upcoming American initiative, the so-called deal of the century. Some countries want to embrace it, and others want to reject it completely.
هذا الكلام الذي حصل في عهد السيد ترامب.
What happened during the era of Trump has never been heard or seen during the eras prior to him. They might have been hiding the policies. Then came Trump with all impoliteness to announce this policy that is categorically against the international legitimacy since 1947.
So because they couldn't agree on how to approach the American initiative, they decided then just to reaffirm, restate previous statements on Palestine, the idea of two-state solution and so on and so forth. I mean, I could see some of the people there either falling asleep or just spacing out because they've heard these words before. Yeah. To be honest with you, if for every time I've heard that statement on Palestine, I had a penny, I would have been a millionaire by now.
There's a lot of risks, and the Middle East, as everybody knows, is volatile, right? So one step forward, two steps back is sort of the quote that you'll hear a lot of people say about it. But it doesn't have to be that way. It could be one step forward that leads to another step. If I could, I think coming at this as a younger person, I think gave me a bit of a perspective of why does it have to be the way it was, right?
When I was your age, people looked at the Middle East, the Christian community, Jewish community, love Israel. It was a emotional attachment. It was a theological attachment. And then there was the Gulf, which was essential to keeping a stable oil supply. And so that was really the balance. Administrations would try to keep the oil running, and they try to keep Israel secure, and they would kind of push and pull in those directions. Now, none of that really is relevant anymore.
Right. I came in with really buying into what Jared was claiming, which was the thing that people really care about in the Middle East is opportunity. I hope to have children, you have grandchildren. What do we want for them? We want opportunity. We want just the ability to make a better life for our children and for our grandchildren and really for ourselves. And that was really what the peace plan that we put forward for the Israeli and Palestinian conflict, it was really what it was all about. It was the potential for opportunity for people who had not seen any of that in such a long time.
And I believe that people respect us when we believe in something, we stand for something greater than ourselves. I think that resonates within the world, especially in the Arab world, which is a religious world.
The difference between success and failure, it could be this, that, and sometimes you just need something because it could go either way. So believing that there's a reason that you're doing what you're doing could be the difference maker when things can go.
The Hebrew prophet Isaiah prophesied that all the nations of the world will come to Jerusalem, whereupon God will resolve their differences, and nation shall no longer lift up sword against nation. This is the paradigmatic metaphor for peace that adorns the United Nations. Jerusalem literally means city of peace. It is also characterized as central to the Arab-Israeli conflict. In the coming months, we would learn whether a more secure Israel and an undivided Jerusalem might actually be central to finding a resolution to the conflict. We hope to see an actualization of Isaiah's vision in a Jerusalem worthy of its name.
Hey, I'm Mati Shoshani, and thank you for watching the TBN Israel YouTube channel. We hope this video gave you greater understanding of Israel and her people. If you haven't already, subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a video. We'd love to hear from you, so be sure to share what you've learned and ask your questions in comments below. And invite your friends to join the conversation.